Hello, everyone. Welcome to our online event about feminism. Today, we will talk about abortion rights, women's reproductive rights, health crisis, and neoliberalism with our guests. At this point, I'm glad to introduce you Malgorzata Joanna from Poland and Vanessa from Italy. Hopefully, each one will transfer to us the social impact of the feminist struggles in the country. Now, I would like to highlight two things. Despite the last few decades' feminist movement struggles and the victories that have succeeded, women's reproductive rights are a constant dispute, even in those societies that are considered to be more progressive and liberal. Women and other feminine gender identities are oppressed within contemporary patriarchal societies. These same societies that may regard themselves as being progressive are actually the ones which harbor a well-established New Age conservatism that lies beneath. What has happened in Poland is an example of an aggressive attack waged on women's reproductive rights at the constitutional level, while at the same time what it reveals is that there is a widespread opinion that women and other femininities should conform to the authority and will of the cis-male perception and imposition of what women's bodies should or shouldn't do. So, hello Malgorzata, nice to meet you.
Hi, nice to
Welcome,
meet you too.
welcome to our conversation. Let's start with our questions. Can you briefly describe the political, historical, social, and religious background of the legal framework's reactionary reforms on women's reproductive rights in Poland?
Gladly, I'm gonna get back a bit historically, but don't worry, I'll try not to get into too much detail. The thing is, especially when it comes to certain social context, the religious context, it's good to know your history. So basically, let's get back to the end of the First World War. This is when Poland reappears on the map after more than 120 years of being divided between neighboring countries. And what happens is we end up with different legal systems because the territory that used to belong to Russia inherited Russian laws. The territory that used to belong to Austria, or more precisely Austro-Hungarian Empire, inherited their laws, and the same with what used to be Prussia or part of Germany. So basically, we have various legal systems, and that also determines what happens when you terminate a pregnancy. So basically, in the territories that used to belong to Austria, not only the woman is being punished for terminating a pregnancy, but also the father of the child, if it is proven that he was encouraging the abortion or knew about it and didn't stop it from happening. So it's quite restrictive. It's partly fictional when it comes to like what's really happening, because of course pregnancies are being terminated, and not every terminated pregnancy results in an act of prosecution. But if you are terminating a pregnancy, you have to be aware that you might be prosecuted. As a woman who was pregnant and the pregnancy was unwanted, and also as people who are helping her. And obviously, having various legal systems in the same country is not ideal. It was the best illustrated perhaps in the case of divorce. So basically, if you were somewhere in Poznan or in Krakow and you wanted to get divorced, feel free, like you get a divorce and you remarry because you want to remarry, end of story. But if you are from what used to be Russian territory, the Polish territory that belonged to Russia, you only could get divorced if your religion was permitting you to. So if you were a Protestant or if you were Jewish, feel free, sign your divorce papers, go get remarried, end of story. However, if you were Catholic, you were basically screwed. because, well, you could get an annulment, but it was really, really bloody difficult, especially under the previous canonical law. So it was virtually impossible. That's what I'm saying. So what people were doing, they were often converting to other religions. But if you were a spouse of someone who converted, that was also not ideal because, well, according to your spouse, they were divorced. But according to you, who didn't convert, well, you are still married to that person. So obviously, what the government wanted to do was to organize a unification of all the laws that we had, especially two biggies, so the penal code and the civic code. And, well, again, we have to get to the religious aspect. The Catholic Church playing quite a predominant role in Poland nowadays, and also between the two world wars, wasn't really happy about the idea, because obviously, if you were a modern country in the 20th century, you wanted to grant your citizens, for example, the right to divorce their spouse. Yes, it might have been controversial socially, but still, you wanted to make it legal for everyone, not just people who used to live in what used to belong to Austria or Prussia. That meant that those people who used to be from the part of Poland that was annexed by Russia, they could get divorced too, even if they were Catholic. That meant the Catholic Church was losing influence, and they were really, really not happy about that. So basically, they were really opposing the unification of the laws in Poland, especially when it comes to divorce, especially when it comes to abortion laws. And there was quite a social fight about it. There were protests, there were a lot of newspaper articles about it. I actually have a book here written by Irena Krzywicka, who was one of the authors really prominent when it comes to discussing issues around sexuality that were controversial to the Catholic Church because they didn't want to lose influence. So fortunately, what happened was in 1932, we did manage to get a new penal code with new abortion laws. They were quite restrictive to our modern standards, but they were quite liberal to the standards of the time. Because in 1932, the law said you could terminate your pregnancy if the pregnancy was resulting from rape or incest or an act of pedophilia defined as sexual relations with someone under 15. You also could terminate pregnancy if it was a risk to the life or health of the mother. Of course, we didn't have such advanced technologies of seeing if everything's all right with the fetus. You couldn't just, have an ultrasonogram in the 30s. So that was not on the table. But in general, the law was quite progressive at the time. And obviously the Catholic Church was not happy about it. However, they did win the divorce battle because up to the beginning of the Second World War in 1939, we still didn't get a unified civil law for the whole country. So still, whether you could divorce your spouse or not depended on where you were from, which was pretty weird, you have to admit that. With the German Nazi occupation, the reproductive rights changed again, but this time they were racially motivated. So if you were a German woman in the Polish territories who were pregnant and the pregnancy was unwanted, tough luck, you had to carry to term because your baby was racially superior. However, if you were Jewish or Polish or Roma or Sinti, you were encouraged to get an abortion. Basically, it was the only time in Polish history so far when the law was openly saying, well, abortion on demand, as many as you want, basically like one every month if you want. But this wasn't to advance the cause of reproductive rights. Obviously, it was just racially based ideology. If you weren't Aryan and blonde and blue-eyed, you weren't supposed to reproduce. So that was basically the logic behind the laws. Then the Second World War ended, and Poland landed behind the Iron Curtain. We were officially independent. We weren't part of the Soviet Union, but the government was heavily dominated by the Soviets, by people loyal to the Soviet Union. So even though we were a separate country, we were in a sovereign country for sure. So obviously the ideological currents of what was happening at the time in Soviet Union highly influenced what was happening in Poland at the time during the communist regime. And at the very beginning of the regime, before the death of Stalin and shortly afterwards, basically what happened was we went back to the law from 1932. So, okay, if you had your legal document from the prosecutor that yes, your pregnancy resulted from rape or incest or sex with a minor, then yes, you can terminate your pregnancy. Or if you have a paper slip from a special medical commission of doctors, so not just one doctor, not just your gynecologist, but a special commission, then sure, you could terminate your pregnancy, but that was it. And of course, officially, the communist regime was saying that men and women are created equal and obviously should have equal rights. But that was the theory. The practice, at least at the beginning of the regime, was that, well, yeah, you can ride a tractor or work in a in a field traditionally dominated by men as a woman, but don't go too far. Don't push it too far. This whole women's rights agenda might be just a Western ideology, so beware. And then after the Stalinization, after Stalin died, and the regime basically switched from being totalitarian with total control of special forces to just authoritarian, so obviously not democratic, but not as restrictive. We finally got a new law. It was in 1956, so basically the same time period that the Stalinization started both in Soviet Union and in Poland. And we started also in social discourse stressing women's rights. So abortion was, so the role of a woman was not only within the family, as the homemaker, but also as an independent human being, a revolutionary thought, I know. So basically, the new law in 1956 said, okay, we keep those two excuses, those two legal excuses to make abortion legal. So women's health or life, pregnancy resulting from either rape or incest or sex with a minor. And the third added excuse to make the termination of pregnancy, which was normally illegal, was severe life circumstances of the woman. And the main logic behind the change was that, well, no shit, Sherlock, women were getting abortions either way. If you are pregnant and you don't want the pregnancy, you're going to do your best to terminate the pregnancy because you don't want to be pregnant, end of story. But abortions in illegal circumstances, so like underground abortions, aren't always that safe. So legalizing abortion was meant to protect women who are getting abortions either way. And up to, I think, 1959, if you wanted to use that third excuse, so like, my life circumstances are just too tough, I don't have money, I don't have a place to live, etc., and we have too big of a family or anything else, the doctors were basically supposed to kind of control what you were saying, like, are you telling the truth? Is it really the case? But after that, so starting from the 60s, they were supposed to just to take you up on your word. So even if you were married to Jeff Bezos and went to the doctor and said to them, I'm sorry, my life circumstances are really terrible, they were supposed to believe you, and in practice that meant that third excuse to make abortion legal, that in practice abortion was available on demand in Poland, starting from, well, legally 1956, in practice 1959. And that was the case till we actually became a democratic country. So this is quite, you can see a paradox in here, because basically right now, Polish women often go abroad, like maybe not necessarily to Sweden or Norway, because the procedure is quite expensive compared to what we earn here. But right now there are initiatives in both countries, and what they want is to actually grant Polish women free abortions because of what happened recently, and I'm going to get to that in a minute. So before that, the situation was quite reversed. So for example, in the 60s, Swedish women were coming to Poland to terminate their unwanted pregnancies. And right now it's the other way around, or it will be the other way around, because basically what happened was that the Catholic Church wanted to have their bills paid. They helped with defeating the communist regime in Poland. And yes, they did. They weren't the only factor determining that we are a democratic country right now. They did play a major role that cannot be denied. So basically, they wanted to have certain privileges back from before the Second World War. Not letting people divorce was not an option that was on the table anymore, but not letting women terminate unwanted pregnancies, that was an option in their opinion. So what happened was, even though during the communist regime, we didn't have religion classes at school, in the 90s, they were moved to schools. Because, the church did so much so that we could switch from communist regime to democracy, let's pay them back. And the same happened with reproductive rights, basically. So in 1993, there was a new law And it wasn't a law about abortions officially. It was about planning families, about family planning. And that law of family planning basically set us back to 1932, plus certain medical techniques that were developed in the meantime. So abortions were, again, allowed only in certain cases, such as resulting from either rape or incest or sex with a minor or any other crime. Pregnancy being a risk to the woman's health or life. And the third factor that was making the abortion legal was a malformation of the fetus. Because, well, in the 90s, it was possible to detect those malformations. Which it wasn't possible in the 30s. And it was very controversial at the time that this law passed. Basically, we had a whole initiative for a referendum on the thing. Personally, I don't think it's a good thing to actually have a referendum on human rights, because it's like, oh, let's vote whether people who are left-handed should have a vote in this country. Like, no, even if the majority of right-handed people tell you that no, let's just put those lefties somewhere. We don't like them. Well, the left-handed people still have human rights. So if I, as a woman, have a right to bodily autonomy, and I cannot be forced to donate a kidney to my dying child of 3 years old, for example, and legally no one can force me to do that, even if the child really is dying, why should anyone be able to force me to, well, rent my uterus for 9 months? But those arguments were not really accepted. Okay, I'm gonna try this again. But those arguments were not really something that was considered in the public debate. And even though there was a social initiative to have a referendum whether we should change our abortion laws, and we gained almost 2 million signatures, the parliament just basically threw them away and passed the bill to their liking. So the law of 1993 was dubbed in the Polish discourse a compromise. But what it was a compromise between men in the parliament and the Polish church. And, well, priests are men in Catholic Church. So basically, one group of men dressed in black dresses had a compromise with other group of men dressed in blue suits, and that was the compromise. And the opinion of Polish women was not really considered, because who cares? And the thing was, there was even a feminist subgroup of the Solidarity movement, this big movement that actually was the prevailing force for ending the communist regime and starting the democratic one. And as soon as that women's subgroup started to oppose the changes to abortion law, it was disbanded. So it was like, okay, yeah, dear women of Solidarity, you played your role. Thank you very much. Now shut up. So even though it's dubbed a compromise, it wasn't a compromise that involved the opinion of Polish women. And in 1997, the left government at the time did their best to expand this bill on family planning, and they added an extra Yeah, so in 1997, the left government tried to add one more reason that could excuse you from the abortion being illegal. So before we had pregnancy resulting from a crime, pregnancy endangering the mother's health or life, and the malformation of the fetus. And now they added the fourth one, which was the same basically as the one from the 1956 bill. Difficult life circumstances of the woman. If you were too poor, had too big of a family, didn't have a place to live, etc., etc. But that addendum to the bill didn't last long because the conservative. Okay, so we had this extra addendum to the bill, to the 1993 bill that was heavily opposed by most of the society. But unfortunately, the left government was not the one that appointed the judges to the Constitutional Court. It was the previous one, the conservative one, the one who passed the bill on family planning, which extremely restricted reproductive rights of Polish women. And what they did, they said that this extra addendum to the bill was unconstitutional. So even if you didn't have any money, even if you didn't have a place to live, or already had, I don't know, 8 children, and you really didn't have it in you to have the 10th one, well, you had to give birth anyways. And that was the first time that the Constitutional Court, dominated by the conservative judges, said to Polish women, we don't care. And the thing was, people didn't really care that much because it didn't impact the reality of terminating the pregnancy in Poland. Because, well, you can have a bill and the bill says something, but it doesn't mean that people are necessarily behaving in a way that's not against what the law says. And the bill criminalizes underground abortions. So, like legally, you cannot pay a medical professional to terminate your pregnancy. But what's different from the law of 1932 and and the law after the war before 1956 is that the woman herself is not punished. So if I pay a doctor to terminate my pregnancy underground, the doctor is punished. I'm not. But if I just go abroad or ingest a pill to terminate my pregnancy, which is easy to do when it's an early pregnancy, then no one is prosecuted. So basically, our 1993 bill on family planning, the so-called compromise, doesn't really impact that much the reality of terminating a pregnancy in Poland if you have either enough money or enough social capital. So if you are from the upper middle class or even middle class and you know where to call or whom to contact, it's not that difficult to terminate a pregnancy. You go to Berlin, you go to Slovakia, you go to Vienna in Austria. It's not cheap, but you can do it. If you know where to look for, You look for Abortion Without Borders. You look for Women on Waves, and they send you Mifeprostol and other pills that will help you terminate your pregnancy safely at home. And even if so basically what happens is that if you have enough capital, either just financial capital or cultural and social capital, you don't worry that much. I mean, it's going to be a pain in the ass, but you can do it. However, if you live in a small town or a small village, if you already have trouble with the access to even normal contraception, because the nearest pharmacy is 10 kilometers from you, and the bus is not really a regular thing around there, well, you won't go to Berlin. You won't have money. You won't have the means. Like, no one will drive you, etc., etc. So basically, what happened was women from the middle class and from the upper class were sleeping soundly because they didn't worry that much. But those who were the poorest, those that were the least educated, were affected the most. And we did have a few cases of actually infanticide, because the mother was, for example, forced by her husband, by the father of the children, to have sex with him. And he was like, oh, but I don't want children. So she kept giving birth to her children, and then she was murdering them and keeping them in the freezer as a form of contraception, I guess. Because funny, did it froze again? So infanticide is not definitely better than terminating a pregnancy, and is definitely and shouldn't be a form of contraception. But that's how it was treated in certain extreme cases. And the irony is that in this infamous bill on family planning that highly restricted reproductive rights of Polish women, the parliament also, officially at least, in theory, wanted us to have sexual education and access to contraceptives, because that actually limits the case of unwanted pregnancies. However, that's not what's happening. So the sexual education at school is virtually non-existent. The official name of the subject is not even sex ed. It's preparing you to the life within the family. So basically what you can learn is like how to hold your infant after you give birth to your baby, which is important, sure. But before that, it would be nice to know how not to end up in unwanted pregnancy. And those right-wing conservative Catholic groups that kept pushing from restriction of the access to abortion since the 1970s, so even during the communist periods, and that were eventually the ones that won in 1993. So those groups didn't stop pushing. They kept pushing after the bill of 1993 and after the verdict of the Constitutional Court in 1997. And unfortunately, those groups, those conservative extreme right-wing groups, are one of the forces behind our current right-wing government. they are not in power per se, but they definitely voted for the current government, and definitely hoping that this will help further the restriction of access to abortion. And they were quite close in 2016. They gained the required number of signatures to propose a bill to the parliament. The bill would basically end even those few exceptions that we have right now. So the case of a really malformed fetus that with lethal malformations, you have to give birth to it. The pregnancy endangers your life. Well, we have to wait until the danger is direct. So, basically like in Ireland, up to the point when they changed the constitution. And that bill ending in parliament resulted in huge protests in Poland. We had the so-called Black Protest, and the bill didn't pass, fortunately. Unfortunately, the parallel initiatives called Let's Save Women, Ratujmy Kobiety in Polish, which would actually grant access to reproductive rights, not only to abortions, but also to contraceptives, to sexual education, etc., etc. That bill didn't pass, even though it also gathered an appropriate number of signatures. But basically the parliament said, you know what, no thank you, reproductive rights of Polish women, we are not interested. Which is what they usually say, unfortunately. And the status quo prevailed. We stayed with the so-called compromise from 1993, even though it wasn't a compromise involving Polish women. And right now, what happened was that almost a year ago, a group of right-wing members of parliament asked Constitutional Court whether this excuse of fetus malformation that made the abortion legal, whether it's not against the Polish constitution. And the thing is, it was already after the Constitutional Court was illegally grabbed by the governing party. So basically what they did in 2015, they didn't swear in certain judges that were rightfully chosen. Instead, they pushed a few judges that weren't rightfully chosen for the Constitutional Court. And also they delayed publication of several verdicts of the Constitutional Court. There was a huge crisis around it. There were also huge protests against the power grab of the Constitutional Court. Nevertheless, that was already that was already a reality. Everybody knew that Constitutional Court is not an independent judicial body. It's controlled by the governing party. And in the middle of the pandemic, on the 22nd of October, the Constitutional Court started its proceedings on whether the excuse of the malformation of the fetus was against the Polish constitution. And some people were hoping that, come on, we are in the middle of the pandemic. They're going to just start the proceedings and never finish them. It's going to go in a limbo. It would be too dangerous to do something like that in the middle of the pandemic, because come on, every time they try to manipulate around the so-called compromise from 1993, even though it wasn't a compromise, there are crowds on the streets. And in the middle of the pandemic, perhaps we shouldn't have big crowds on the streets. Perhaps it's not the best time. Despite that, it looks like they were hoping that people were gonna actually stay home because of the pandemic. So what the Constitutional Court, dominated by Law and Justice, unlawfully elected judges, ruled that no, the fetus has the right to life, and you cannot terminate the pregnancy when the fetus is malformed. That case, abortion in that case would be illegal. Legally, that verdict becomes legal reality only after they publish it in an official legal magazine, so to speak. Like every bill has to be published there, every verdict of the Constitutional Court, every international treaty we sign and ratify. You know, this is like the official source of what is law. And what they did, for now, they still haven't published it. But I mean, the verdict, they published it online. So like we know what is the verdict, we know what is the justification of the verdict, but it's not legally binding yet. But of course, if you are a medical professional, you are afraid that some overzealous prosecutor will prosecute you if you terminate someone's pregnancy with malformed fetus, with Patau syndrome or Edwards syndrome, for example, or with ancephalia, or any other really, really serious malformations. So certain hospitals basically declined women who were like already pregnant, already knew that they couldn't give birth to a healthy baby. Well, they just told them, sorry, go away. We are not risking that. Unfortunately, we have the so-called abortion dream teams, which is like an informal gathering of women helping other women get access to abortion. And since if you like provide it yourself, it's not penalized, as I said before. And if someone is not helping you directly, but just giving you information like, okay, you know, this is the website of Women on Web, order the pills from here. They are gonna, or we are gonna help you get to Netherlands because we know you are in the 22nd week of your pregnancy and the hospital is refusing to perform an abortion to which you still have the right. Because, you know, the verdict was not published. So fortunately, those informal organizations, they are helping. And during the protests right now, basically everyone is having a huge transparent with their phone number. So again, you won't be alone if you've seen this number, if you know what number to call. But again, the divide is social or even a class divide, because if you are from a really, really tiny village from somewhere in the middle of nowhere, the chances are you didn't see that number. So even with the financial help from abroad, because as soon as Ireland changed its constitution and stopped forcing Irish women to go to Britain, basically the whole international funding that was helping Irish women was diverted from there to Malta and Poland, so two European countries with the most restrictive abortion rights. So if you know where to go, if you know where to look for help, you are not alone and you won't be prosecuted. However, not everyone has the means, has the knowledge, etc., etc. So it's still not the solution. And the reason, well, I'm speculating right now, but the probable reason the verdict is still not published is that the government simply is afraid, because the scale of the current protests, the protest after the 22nd of October, those are the biggest protests since basically the fall of communism, since 1989. Those are the biggest social protests during my lifetime. And they happened in the middle of the pandemic. So even though everyone is wearing their masks and doing their best to keep the social distance, and even though we have the data from Black Lives Matter protests suggesting that when you protest outside and are wearing masks, the spread of the virus is not significant. Still, the government propaganda is using the protest to justify their failure in combating the pandemic, because, well, yeah, they are failing in combating the pandemic, unfortunately. So basically, so the government propaganda is using the protest as a pretext to justify their failure in combating the pandemic. The protests are still ongoing. They are slightly smaller right now. Also, well, it's not, I mean, it would be great if it was warm the whole year here, but it's not. So I remember the protest in 2015 after the power grab on the Constitutional Court. They started in December. It was really, really freezing, and it looks like we are heading in the same direction, like freezing our asses off in defense of our rights. And what they are suggesting, because, well, they got afraid of the reaction of Polish women mostly, they are suggesting another compromise, air quotes. So what happens basically is, like, let's say in here we have rights of fetuses, and in here we have the rights of women to their bodily autonomy. They set the first compromise here, and then they said, like, you know what? Let's set another compromise. Like, let's meet halfway. So, like, we met halfway, and then they are like, you know what? Let's set another compromise. Let's meet halfway. And it's always the side of reproductive rights of women that is being moved. Not the anti-choice or so-called by themselves pro-life. They are not really pro-life. They don't care about the rights of people with disabilities after they are born. They don't really pay much attention to the question of violence within the family. They actually want the traditional gender roles to be reinforced rather than questioned, even though questioning them can lead to fewer instances of violence within the family, violence towards children, etc., violence towards women, etc., etc. So they aren't really pro-life, they are mostly pro-fetus, but they are winning the propaganda war. They are the ones saying, let's meet halfway, and that halfway keeps to be closer and closer to the right. So right now there are two legal initiatives within the Polish parliament. One is suggested by the Polish president, another by another group. And since they got afraid after the social reaction, after the huge protests that turned also in certain places mostly into anti-government protests. So it's actually interesting because in many cases you have to redirect the protests to be about our reproductive rights again, because people are like, oh, let's fuck the government. And well, yeah, sure, I'm not gonna, defend the right-wing government in Poland, but the protests are not just that we don't like them. The protests were started by a specific thing, so let's not forget that. And those initiatives in the parliament, they are trying to go ahead and somehow mitigate the unpublished verdict of the Constitutional Court. So what they want to do is they want to say, like, okay, if they diagnose your fetus with Down syndrome, for example, you don't have the right to terminate your pregnancy. However, if the malformation of your fetus is really little, meaning Edwards syndrome, Patau syndrome, ancephalia, or any other long list of medical malformations, you won't be forced to wait for the miscarriage or wait for carrying the pregnancy to term, and then you won't be forced to just watch your baby die in suffering, which is inhumane. And it's not just this is something I'm saying, although of course I am saying that it is inhumane to force you to watch your baby suffer unnecessarily. But there is also a legal case. So in front of the United Nations, there was a case. It was a case in Peru. A 17-year-old was raped, and so it's not just me saying that forcing someone to watch their infants die in suffering is inhumane, but there is a concrete specific case. There was a specific case in front of the United Nations. It was a case of Llanto y Huaman versus Peru in 2005. And it was a case of a 17-year-old who was raped and wanted to terminate the pregnancy. Malformed, and it was known that the fetus was malformed. And Peru didn't. They forced her to carry the pregnancy to term and to give birth to a very, very sick infant. And then not only they forced her to watch him die in suffering, they also forced her to breastfeed the infant before he died. So we have a specific case saying that the thing that the verdict of the Constitutional Court would force Polish women to is actually inhumane and is equal to torture. And that's not a good look internationally either. So what they are trying to do in the parliament is to say, okay, we won't force you to give birth in case of pregnancy when fetus has lethal deformations. We won't force you to watch your child die in pain, but you don't have the right to decide whether you are ready to welcome into the world a child with severe disability, even though Poland So what is being taken away with this new initiative after the verdict, and to mitigate the verdict, unpublished verdict for now at least, is to again, meet us halfway, but this half is getting smaller and smaller and smaller, because basically we had again this halfway we are meeting at is getting the halves are getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and we had around 500, 600, like in the hundreds. That was the number of legal abortions in Poland up to recently. The estimated number of illegal abortions or abortions abroad, which are, well, legal because you go to countries where abortion is legal to terminate your pregnancy. The estimated number is 100,000, so you can see the difference. But of those 600, 500 abortions that were legally performed in Poland, around 98%, 95%, depending on the year, those were the cases of fetus malformation. So what keeps happening is basically like they cut away the following pieces of reproductive rights of Polish women. And of course, the pieces they are cutting away are getting smaller and smaller, but that's just because the part that's left is extremely small. And even within the legal framework from before the verdict of the Constitutional Court, you can suspect that some of the cases that at least theoretically would be legal to terminate the pregnancy in Poland, they were being terminated either abroad or in some other cases, because when you look at the numbers of how many children with certain defects should have been born out of a number of births in general, well, that number is way smaller than statistically possible. So those pregnancies did not just, evaporate. So the right to terminate your pregnancy legally was fiction already, even before the verdicts, in many parts of the country, especially in the East. Apparently, there were even some medical doctors bragging that, in our voivodeship, which is like a district, an administrative district, we don't perform preterm screening. So you cannot learn if your children, if your fetus has any malformation, because they just don't perform those tests. And that sucks, not only when it comes to your reproductive rights, but like even if it's a wanted pregnancy, even if you are ready to raise a child with severe disability, you might be, even though Poland as a country is not helping much in that, unfortunately. But you might be, then you want to help medically as much as you can. And certain malformations can actually be, well, maybe not prevented, but then can be made into less severe cases in utero. So you can operate on the fetus, but to actually learn that you have to operate, you have to do the test first. So a medical doctor bragging that, we don't just do those screenings is really stupid, and shows that those pro-life groups, they are mostly pro-fetus, and they don't really give a damn about what's happening with your child after it's born, unfortunately. So more or less, this is the reality right now. I'm quite a pessimist. I think they are gonna pass those laws in the parliament. So they are gonna make it legal, make terminating a pregnancy legal in cases of lethal malformations, but illegal in all the other cases. And it's just gonna further down this social and class divide, because like if I'm pregnant and this is an unwanted pregnancy, I know what to do. If I don't have financial means, I know who to call to just, lend me some money. But if you are in a really, seriously, so if I was pregnant and this was an unwanted pregnancy, I know what to do, I know where to go, I know whom to call. If I don't have financial means, I know a friend who could lend me money in extreme cases, right? But if you are in a really, really desperate situation, there is no one you can borrow from. So again, and if you are in a really, really desperate situation, you also probably won't have the means to raise a child with special needs. Because if you have children with severe disabilities, they have special needs. They need special help. They need special equipment. And of course, we should provide it to them. But when we don't, we can just force someone to uproot their whole life. And they don't, because of course they can give up such a child for adoption. You know what our right-wing government did a few years back? They severely limited international adoptions. And people in Poland say, well, because your country, your government is not helping you to raise children with severe disabilities, people are not that willing to adopt such children. So even if they are like legally free and you could adopt them, people are not lining up. Everyone's, waiting for a healthy infant, which is unfair and it shouldn't be the case, but that's the reality we have to face. And most Polish children with disabilities that were up for adoption were being adopted internationally. They were being adopted in Netherlands or in Germany. And several years ago, the right-wing government said, no, we can do that. Those are Polish children. They have to be raised Polish and Catholic and whatnot. And as a result, they are just waiting in care of the social services, which is not ideal because children should be loved and raised within a family. Forcing women to give birth, even in case of unwanted pregnancy, that's not something that leads to loved, wanted children being raised within a family. So if you really care about children, as so-called pro-lifers claim they do, you also should care about reproductive rights and access to abortion. But unfortunately, that's not the case, and probably we're gonna have another piece of what's left over of the access to abortion in Poland chopped off.
Great information you gave us. Next question is, how can we measure the social and centered impact of the promotion of a highly restrictive legislation on women's reproductive and abortion rights?
That is a great and also unfortunately very difficult question, I believe, because there is too much ideology around the issue. So even if you do your best to conduct some objective measurements, there will always be someone from extreme right wing usually saying, no, your data is not right. It's not true that restricting the access to abortion in Poland should be directly linked with the rates of infanticide. So even though there is a correlation, there's always been a correlation between those two. It's not politically correct, but in a right-wing sense of the political correctness, to point that out. I'm afraid that the best tools to measure such impacts are actually within international organizations. So I would trust the measurements of United Nations. I would trust the measurements and the statistics published by World Health Organization, because they have access to gigantic amounts of data, and they have the tools to analyze them, to analyze such data and to compare it within the countries. But they usually appear with a delay, right? Unfortunately, this is something that can be used as a tool in the social discourse in the next decade. So, like, if I have a daughter, it might help her get access to legal abortion in Poland. But if I were pregnant right now and the pregnancy was unwanted, it's not going to help me now. What could help me is international solidarity and conducting Abortion Without Borders or Women on Waves.
Great. Furthermore, Malgorzata, we would like to know, why do you think women's rights are so heavily attacked in the context of global health and social crisis?
I think it's because it's something that appears to be within reach and within grasp, and something that can redirect social unrest into something specific, but not necessarily seen as connected to other issues, even though it very much is, as I said before. Restricting the access to abortion impacts the most those that are the poorest and those that already are at a disadvantage in many, many aspects of their lives. The thing is, it's not usually seen that way. It's just this debate, like, are you pro-choice, are you pro-life? So what happens is, if you disappear the social aspects of reproductive rights and women's rights, it becomes just this easy ideological tool of redirecting the social anger. So that's why I think it's really, really important to underline that, to underline intersectionality and to underline social aspects and economic aspects of reproductive rights. Because otherwise, we are basically stuck with this liberal or neoliberal discourse of individual rights, which is to a certain extent working, but it's working for people with means. And we shouldn't limit social discourse to just that, because it's just unfair. So I think it's because it's easy, because I mean, the women's rights are attacked because it's easy, it's seen as easy, it's seen as just ideology, even though it's not. And I think it's also a tool of redirecting people from thinking about more complex, interconnected issues. I'm not saying it's something done instead of another thing, because like, no, it's all together. Like the access to healthcare is crucial both in the context of reproductive rights and in the context of a current pandemic, obviously. But it's easier to protest just the reproductive rights than to say, hey, we have a problem with healthcare in general. So I think it might be that. And also another thing, I believe that in the conservative discourse, there is this golden era somewhere in the past, where women were just cooking dinner and making sandwiches for their children and their husbands and looking after the home, and everybody was happy, etc. And it's fiction. It's obviously fiction. The world never looked that way, and even if it did, it looked that way only for a small social group. But this vision got somehow idealized, and I think there is this unspoken belief that if you tell women, just go back to giving birth and cooking, and like, don't preoccupy yourself with anything beyond the nursery or the kitchen, then we're gonna magically move back to this traditional periods of golden ideal times, which never actually occurred.
Okay, let's move on. Do you think that the pandemic affected women's access to reproductive health services?
Very much, yes, I think so. I believe there was even, I'm not sure whether you are familiar with American-Canadian comedian Samantha Bee. Yes. I'm a huge fan of hers.
Yes.
And I believe she had a clip about the access to reproductive rights during the pandemic. So it's more difficult. Even, just going to your OBGYN is more difficult during the pandemic. You have to prepare. You'll basically think twice whether you really need to go. It's more difficult to give birth because I don't know how it looks like in Greece right now, but for example, in Poland, the access to so-called family birth is restricted. And the justification is that the partner of the mother would be just like one additional person. So maybe let's not invite one more person to the hospital. And I understand the logic. I really do. But first of all, usually the partner of the mother is someone who lives already with her. So like, if they are sick, so is she probably, right? So there is that. I personally know someone who gave birth during the pandemic, and she decided to actually have a home birth because she was afraid of going to the hospital, and also she wanted to have her family around her. She says it was beautiful. It was all safe. She had her midwife and everything. So I'm very happy it worked out well for her. But even in such a case, you have to be ready to move everything to hospital because, things can go wrong.
Mhm.
And if there are a lot of ambulances driving around COVID patients because this hospital said, no, we don't have any more beds or any more oxygen, drive that patient somewhere else. So, you've got ambulances driving around, then there are fewer ambulances that can drive you to the nearest hospital when something is going wrong in the case of your home birth. So I'm afraid that our access to reproductive health services is greatly diminished during the pandemic. And I think it might be even more the case in Poland because right now our healthcare is really on the verge of collapsing and is working mostly because every medical professional in the country is giving 200% out of them. And, thank them for doing so. Let's thank them for doing so, but that shouldn't be the basis of the whole system.
To conclude, are there any successful feminist strategies? What can we learn from the feminist movement in Poland here in Greece?
Don't stop. I think that would be my main takeaway from that, because the same as the extreme right wing, they kept pushing those bill projects like let's restrict the reproductive rights. They threw that project away. There was another, like let's restrict, etc., etc. So we have to do basically the same. Like they threw away our project, Let's Save Women, in it was in January 2018. Right now, we are gathering signatures under a similar project, depenalizing helping people in getting abortions. And granting the access to abortion. So I think I'm really inspired by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez shoes, the ones that even ended up on an exposition later on. They had holes in them, and I remember realizing after one of the political campaigns I took part in that my shoes also had holes in them. And we didn't end up with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, unfortunately. But the thing is, she said, even while donating those shoes for an exposition, she said that for her to be elected, 100 other women had to have similar shoes worn out because they were participating in various political campaigns for various causes. So even though my shoes ended up in the trash can and not in the museum, I still think that it's okay to be those 100 women because we need each other and we need to help each other. So I'm really glad there are such people in Poland as, for example, Natalia Broniarczyk, who is the main spokesperson behind Abortion Dream Team, the Polish branch of Abortion Without Borders, and she's one of those women helping other women get access to abortion. Legal access to legal abortions, even though not necessarily performed in Poland or performed at home by just ingesting a pill, which is not illegal, fortunately. So there is that. Let's not stop doing what we believe is right, and let's not stop in our solidarity without borders. That would be my takeaway. Thank you.
Great. Well, Malgorzata, you gave us so much interesting information. Thank you for the great communication we had. We wish you all the best.
Thank you very much. Can't wait to hear from my Italian counterpart.